Oh,
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Happy Friday, day 20, April 10th. We've been doing this for a week, and we are super pumped today because we have a very, very special guest, and I'm going to throw it to Penny in a moment to introduce Ellen. But before we do that, just very quickly, for those of you who've been waiting, about our little poetry contest, we had a little poetry smack off between a poem called Kissing in Vietnamese and a poem called Good Bones. And after 2 days of tabulations, it was a very, very close vote again. But the winner is Good Bones. And so those were each poems. And so when we come back next week, I think maybe we'll revisit the winner of the page poem and the winner of the stage poem and maybe have a little conversation about that.
yeah. You can make this world beautiful. What a beautiful introduction to Ellen Stackable, who I met virtually. I can't remember how we met the first time, but what I remember is we presented together at NCTE in 2010 in this room where I think we had maybe a dozen people, maybe. About the writer's notebooks that we were sending across the country to each other. My kids in New Hampshire were writing, sending them to you in Tulsa. Your students, your English students in your high school classroom were responding. And we had this, like, just as always, when you bring stuff out of the room and into the world, kids really write differently and with more of a sense of audience. So it was such a cool way to get to know you. And then, of course, you started this amazing project called Poetic Justice. And I have been blessed to be with you twice at Mabel Bassett in Tulsa, well, outside of Tulsa, an hour and a half outside of Tulsa. So I thought if you could just start, we want to celebrate you as a teacher, as somebody making something beautiful in the world through poetry. And thought if you could tell us a little bit about Poetic Justice, what it is and who's in it and what you do.
So we started in 2014, and it was just one other gal and myself, and she was a spoken word poet. And I don't really consider myself a poet. I write poetry, but I wouldn't self-describe myself that way. And the idea, but I have always had this kind of core value that writing has the power to change lives. And that's was kind of the core of my teaching values all the way through teaching high school and at a local community college. So I just jumped at the chance because I had been doing some graduate research stuff on incarceration of women in Oklahoma, and we have the highest rate in the country, in the world. And I started looking for ways in and spent months trying to do that. And then finally, a friend of mine that I teach with, he was doing spoken word poetry with the men at the county jail. So I tagged along one night and said, we need to do this with the women. And so that's kind of how we started. And at first it was really more spoken word poetry. And I think as we went along, you know, in the course of that first year, I started to see spoken word poetry is super powerful, but it's also reminds me almost of like a shook up bottle of soda. And when you release it, it just comes spraying out in every direction. You know, it's just like so much emotion, so much things that kids process, because I was sponsoring spoken word at our school. And so I think what makes it so effective there is that you have a follow-up. You have the ability to come alongside the kid and say, you know, let's talk about what you just wrote about. But in prison, you don't have that opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so you really need to provide a safe space for them to write and process trauma. And so that's when we started moving more and more into just writing poetry. And I love it because if I had walked into prison and said, we're going to write essays or we're going to write reports or something, they would have just frozen because most of them have come from marginalized educations. It doesn't mean they are uneducated or ineloquent, but they have come from marginalized educational experiences. So poetry, because there are no rules, is just this perfect way for them to go straight from their heart to the page and then begin to experience healing. And then when you're doing it in a group, and Penny, you experience this as they start to share their poems, there's this sense of community where other women say, oh my gosh, I experienced that too. Or, you know, I feel the same way you do. And so we really have a setup in our classes, both in the jail and the prison, where we sit in a circle There's no hierarchy. We don't call ourselves teachers. We call ourselves facilitators.
Mm.
And you never feel like you're in prison.
I would agree with that. I think that the power of what happens in that room in that small space of time is something I'd never experienced. It also took a lot of my preconceptions about who is in prison and busted them apart. The stories you told me, the stories some of the women told me, the very notion that the very icebreaker you used at the start of the first time I was there was, what's your favorite book?
Oh,
And
yeah.
English teachers could hear the books these women were calling their favorites. And I can't just name one. Let me just tell you 4 or 5. And they were so well read and so passionate because they have a lot of time to read that I was just overwhelmed. And I remember leaving and telling you, like, not many of them mentioned poets. And you said, well, there's almost no poetry in the prison library. Do you remember that? Because we were both like, here are these women dedicated to poetry every single, at least once a month, every time you come, and they don't have any poetry to read. So it was just, to me, just listening to the stories, I'm still stunned because I was there March 10th with you, March 11th, maybe it was. And again, we asked them, what do you love to read? And just, it's amazing. They are well educated, well read.
Yeah, and they have such a breadth of reading and depth of reading. You know, they're always willing to try something new. You know, I'm doing sort of a informal book club with 2 of my favorite students that are at a different facility right now, and we alternate. She'll pick one, and then I'll pick one, and she always picks like these super depressing books, and I like more the upbeat ones. And so now we're kind of in middle ground. We're reading the Earthsea trilogy by Ursula K. Le Guin.
Yeah.
And I don't know if she likes it. I can't tell yet.
Mm.
So Ellen, what does a visit or a class look like? What do
Well,
you do?
when we walk in, so everything that we do, Kelly, from the moment we walk in to the moment we leave has, you know, what educators call hidden curriculum. So there's an intentionality. There's not a scriptedness, but there's an intentionality. And the intention is you're a person of worth and you matter. So when we walk in, you know, we greet them as friends because they are, which is kind of counter to what you see happening usually with most groups that go into prison. And then, you know, we do introductions, icebreakers. We're all sitting in a circle. And the icebreaker is usually tied into whatever the prompt is that night. So like when we do odes, which are small poems of Thanksgiving, we often start our beginning classes with that. We ask them, what is one thing that you're thankful for today? And I have learned so much about radical gratitude from the women in prison because they are thankful for so many things and that we take for granted. So then we go from that into, we do the example poems, and the example poems for the prompt all come from other incarcerated women, which is really, really powerful. For instance, on the ode one, there's an ode to the geese, and it's a poem about the geese that fly over the razor wire fence and are free to do that. And they're free to come and they're free to go. And this woman just writes about how thankful she is for that picture of freedom.
So one of them wrote Ode to Noodles. Oh, yeah. I have the collections in my class, and my students are always like, she's talking about ramen, isn't she? I'm like, yeah.
Or another favorite of mine is the Ode to Shower Number 3, which is like this certain shower at Mabel Bassett where there's 1,400 women, and there's one shower that actually has some water pressure and some hot water. And so now that shower is there's always a line for it ever since she wrote that poem.
So, you know, I was there, the women write, then they share, it becomes like this powerful, like it just gains energy. And then when we were there in March, we left because they told us to get off the yard. Do you remember that? The one, they came and said, you guys are late. You need to get off the yard. And the sun was setting. The geese were actually landing on the yard. The women followed us all the way to the gates where we had to go through that series of gates with the razor wire. And were singing. Do you remember that? They were singing behind us with such joy. And the whole experience from the time we arrived about 5 till we left that night, I don't know, 7:30, is a just a gift to them that you believe in them and you see them. And I think it's so powerful. So I'm curious, as someone who's now done this for 6 years, what
Right.
these women have taught you about creativity and writing and poetry.
Wow. So many things. I think poetry has always been really important to me. You know, it's come to me in my best times and my worst times to bring me comfort, to bring me a sense of that I'm not alone. But I guess I had never seen it in such a living, active way as I have since I've been working with the women. And I'm just always amazed that I think you tend to think of poetry. What is it? Who was it? Pablo Neruda that said he was writing a poem that he started it, and like 10 years later, he was still working on it. And so that's kind of been my preconception of poetry. It's like, you know, you have to really watch every single word and, you know, labor and labor and labor. And I think that is part of poetry, definitely. But I also see that it is an incredible outlet for creativity and for release. And you know, some of the analogies they come up with, some of the metaphors, some of the word pictures and the imagery is just, it can be both startling and beautiful. And it's inspired me, honestly.
I was interested in how what you really do is quick writing with them. They have a poem, you often talk a little bit about it, they blast something out, and many times they publish right there that day by sharing it with the room,
Yes.
reading it with the room. And I think that's just an interesting way to look at a class period or, you know, a month dedicated to poetry.
Well, and we know we only have 2 hours and then we have to leave. And we also realize that they have, you know, 7 days besides that when we're not there. And so for them to have the courage to share in an environment where everything says don't be vulnerable, do not share, is pretty amazing. And we have a really disparate group. It's not like all these women knew each other before they came to our class. We typically have a waiting list of over 100 women that want to be in our class.
And you're in every prison and every jail in Oklahoma. Now
not
you're
every jail.
in San Diego?
Well, the jails are county jails, and so there's
Okay.
lots and lots of those. But we are in every woman's prison.
And in
And
San Diego
how
now.
how long are the classes? How many visits constitutes a class?
Well, we do 6 weeks in county jail because it's kind of a triage. I would call it a trauma triage, where they have just been arrested. They don't know if they're going to get out. And so we may only have them once. So we try really hard to make every single class count in that situation. But in the prisons, we know that we're going to have 8, you know, they're going to be there a long time. And so we have, hang on just a second. I've got it. I want to.
Things like that happen.
But we started off, the first time we came to a prison, it was 6 weeks. And the women said, no, that's not enough. We're just beginning to experience healing. So we upped it to 8 weeks. And now we're at 10 weeks. And then they have the option of doing an advanced class. And in the advanced class, they not only do we do kind of a deeper dive into poetry and some forms, but they also have an opportunity to do a project. And that can be a project that is just writing, or it can be writing plus something else. Like we've had people do sculptures, we've had them do quilts, and they accompany them. There's always a theme to their writing. We've had them do interview project where they go in and interview hundreds of women at that prison about the same question. And we have one student whose project was to do she was like this really hard bitten, kind of no nonsense veteran of Desert Storm. And she saw her best friend blown up by an IED, and it started this cycle of drugs and ended up with her in prison. So her project was to do a small act of kindness every day for a year and to write about it. And she did every day, the entire year. Then she did it the second year, and now she's on year 2.5, and she's still doing it. So she's changing the atmosphere of the prison itself. Even though she may not get out for a long time, she knows that she can bring change in other ways.
Well, and the change that you're bringing to them, I mean, sometimes, I don't know if rehabilitation is the right word, but that using writing as a process for introspection, for you actually healing, right? That going through that process you know, when they get out, they're going to get out better people because they've gone through, it's like just being stuck somewhere. It's a vehicle in which to really, think about things.
Yeah.
Well, somebody pointed out to me yesterday, we were interviewing a gal for an internship, and I said, why us? What do you think? And she said, well, you are one of the only groups I've ever seen that works with incarcerated people and doesn't have an agenda. And you're not trying to give them something. It comes through them. It comes through their own agency. It comes through empowering themselves. So I would say our classes really are about healing and restoration. They are therapeutic writing.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that 3% of women in Oklahoma get parole.
That was under the old governor. It's a little better now. Not much.
Did Tina get
changes since that happened? So Tina was, she's the one that wrote The Shower Number 3. She was a full commutation in January and signature, and then the governor stopped signing things when the COVID crisis came. And it would make sense to release more people because then you have less chance of it spreading in prison. So no, she hasn't yet. And she was actually, what happens oftentimes in prison, inmates who are not good human beings, know you're going to get out contraband in your cell, or they will, jump, they'll fight back to delay your release. And so Tina was in a really unsafe part of prison, and another one of our students, Jax, her out, and now she's at Jax's.
Jax is such a good human being.
Did I lose you guys?
No, I can.
No,
breaking up,
slowing down.
Yeah. So Ellen, I want to honor the fact that you were a CNN hero in 2018, and in fact, of course, I follow you on Instagram and all those things. But there's a documentary that was done. Your son produced it, I believe. Correct. And it's on the website, which I'm linking to our Padlet, because it is so powerful. And I had my students analyze how it was created, because it's a beautiful piece. And, we're all stuck at home. It's about an hour to watch the story of these women, which will just knock you out. But then there are a series of videos that came when they came back to interview many of the same women for the CNN Heroes pieces that they put together. And when it came through that you were in the top 10, I teared up. I was so excited for the program, for the possibility. What are you going to do? You got some kind of a award for that, correct?
Yeah, it was actually $100,000.
And what are you going to spend it on?
Well, so we've been using it. So since that happened, we had about 40 volunteers. We weren't in San Diego. We weren't in Tijuana or South Carolina. So we have now expanded to several more areas, and we have 70 volunteers. And so we used it for that. Part of it. I'm now part-time. I'm not teaching in the high school anymore. And we have one other part-time person working for us. And then we redid Gray Matter. The same people that did it, not my son, but Meg, the producer, wanted to update it with the updated statistics and stuff. And so we're getting ready at some point to figure out how to release that. It's harder now because we're all virtual. So I'm not sure what we'll do on that.
Yeah. Such incredible work you're doing. It's just truly an honor for us to get to spend a little time with you in the midst of National Poetry Month. Somebody who's bringing poetry.
I've heard so much about you. I've heard so much about you through Penny, and so it's such a pleasure and an honor to meet you, Ellen. And thank you for the work that you are doing.
Well, thanks. It has changed my life. They have changed my life, And I think right now, especially, I've been working on all the different lessons from the inside that I've learned. They taught me, how do you negotiate grief without saying goodbye? Because they have all lost people they love and haven't said goodbye. They've taught me radical generosity and radical gratitude. They've taught me the joy of learning, not when you're in class, but just learning because you love to learn. How to be content in the moment and live in the moment and not live in what you lost or what you're afraid might come next. And those lessons are all perfect for now.
They sure are.
For sure.
Thank you for your time. This has been a real treat. And I hope people will follow the links and learn even more about it, because it's an amazing program, and they can order the journals like I did, the anthologies of poetry from the teacher or from the inmates. And I have them. I always have one day during the semester when I put them on all the desks and say, I want you to spend 10 minutes, choose some poetry to read. And they are just stunned. I told you last fall, one of my students took one of each of the collections and came up to me at the end of class and said, could I take these with me? And came back the next Tuesday and said he had read all of them. I don't know who's incarcerated that he knows, but he needed something that work could give him. So thank you.
Well, yeah, because they shatter your preconceptions and your biases.
They do. They really do. You are a treasure, a hero for sure. Thanks for your time.
Well, it's good to see you again, Penny, and nice to meet you, Kelly.